from some of the activities that I've been involved in India over the last several years. And unfortunately, we had planned actually in July to have another training opportunity at the Central Institute of Indian Languages in Mysuru, but of course, pandemic has prevented that sort of thing. So hopefully, inshallah, I will have a chance to visit India again next year when things settle down a little more. I'm going to try and speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then open the floor to questions and comments and feedback. I would encourage you as we go through, if issues come up or you have something you want to clarify or you have a question, that you pop that in the chats so that at the end, I guess, Madhuri, you will try and help us.
Yes, yes, I will.
We can review through the chat at the end, and we can see what issues have come up. So rather than interrupting the discussion as we go, please put your comments and questions in the chat. I'm going to turn my video off now for bandwidth reasons, so please excuse me if I disappear from your screen. Okay, the title of my presentation today, as you can see, is Documentation, Description, Revitalization, and snog, marry or avoid, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So the talk today, I will make the talk available today through my website. Kavita generously mentioned it to you. It's here on the screen now. So after the talk, I will upload it to that website under presentations, and you are free to download it and use it for non-commercial purposes. I want to give my thanks to Julia Salabank, who'll be speaking in another webinar, and to my colleagues David Nathan and Lee Stubrin, but to assure you that I am entirely to blame for any mistakes or errors that I've made from the work that we've done together. So let me just give you a quick overview of what I plan in the next 45 minutes. We'll talk about some terminology, and then what I want to do is to look at some relationships or possible relationships. The talk today is going to be to some extent philosophical, sociological, and also political, in that I'll be exploring these relationships, not so much from a linguistic perspective, but from a philosophical, sociological, and political one. So the possible connections between language documentation and language description, between description and revitalization, and then between documentation and revitalization. So the triad, the three of these, we're going to look at each of the connections between them. And then towards the end, I'll suggest some alternative approaches that we might start thinking about adopting and possibly developing for the future. And then I'll finish up with a couple of takeaway conclusions. Now, the subtitle for my talk today is actually comes from a fortunately now extinct BBC program that was called Snog, Marry, Avoid. I'm doing this for a bit of fun. It's just meant to be light-hearted metaphor for talking about the kind of general topic. I'm not in any way endorsing this particular program. I think it actually is quite terrible. And fortunately, it's not shown anymore. But the conceptual issue that underlies it, and which turns up in everyday conversation here in the UK, I think can be quite useful. So in the program, contestants are asked to make decisions, and they're given three choices. do they want to snog this, this other contestant, which means having a short-term temporary relationship, possibly even just for a few moments of commitment to the future, no real engagement with the other person, but just a kind of temporary short-term thing. The second alternative that they're offered is a relationship that has that title, marry, by which is meant some kind of longer-term, deeper relationship, a multifaceted interconnection that would have a future pathway for development. And of course, the third one is shown a picture of the other contestant, is to simply avoid them. Like it says, have nothing to do with them at all. So what I'm going to think about is just as a sort of, in a way, a light-hearted metaphor, is to think about the relationships between documentation, description, and revitalization in terms of these snog, marry, avoid categories. So let's look at some terminology. I've been throwing these terms around here, and I will use them in a particular way. So let's start with language documentation. There are actually two major senses in which the term language documentation is used. And the first of these is really sort of has its origins in the late 19th and early 20th century, and comes out of a tradition developed by, among others, by Franz Boas. It's still practiced today, and there's still quite a lot of researchers who follow this kind of model. And the characteristics included brief field work. So generally, Boas and his students would go to the field, whatever that was, and they would spend 4 weeks or 6 weeks during the summer. It was not a long-term thing. It was always brief, and they would stay on the reservation or on the distant Pacific island for that brief period of time. The research method was to collect dictated texts, vocabulary, and grammatical forms. So they would ask their informants, as they called them, to dictate texts so that they could write them down as the person was speaking. They saw it as part of a broad anthropological enterprise to save disappearing languages and cultures. Linguistics really wasn't a separate field in this at this time in North America, separated off from anthropology. It was one of the 4 fields of anthropology. It was also Boas also saw it as part of a humanistic enterprise, understanding the nature of human beings and societies, so people as social entities, and he was particularly keen to combat racism and discrimination. So he was argued very strongly against some of the racist views that were current in the early 20th century, in particular, leading up to the period of the Second World War. There's an excellent recent book that has come out that focuses on this Boasian conception of humanistic studies. It included some training and engagement with native speakers, both as producers of the data, the people who knew stuff from which you were interested in obtaining, but also as co-authors. So some of the grammars that were written were jointly authored. And they used whatever was available in terms of the latest technology for them. So we see, there's a nice picture, I think, from the 1920s, which was a Plains Indian recording on an Edison wax cylinder. I believe this is a recording of some singing from the Plains Indians. And the goal, what they were aiming to produce, was a so-called Boasian trilogy of a collection of texts, a grammar, descriptive grammar, and a dictionary. And that was the sort of the output that they aimed for. And much of the material that was collected from the fieldwork done during this period ended up in various archives, but that wasn't a goal of the project. They didn't set out to archive their material. Now, there's a second sense of documentation, which we can associate, really started in the early 1990s, and various people have been involved in developing it. Christian Lehmann, Nicholas Himmelmann, Tony Woodbury, various others. But here's a nice summary which Himmelmann makes, which is that it's about compiling a representative and lasting record of a language or one of its varieties. So the focus here is collecting primary data and analyzing it. And that primary data, those audio and video recordings, should be available not only for the researcher, but also for the wider community of researchers and speakers. Why? Because of accountability. So if we make a particular analysis, make a claim about a language, we should be able to go back to the data and primary data and analysis, which must therefore be stored for a long time and preserved, which then brings to the fore as a fundamental component the notion of archiving, particularly digital archiving. Himmelmann also argues that this work can best be done through interdisciplinary teams. So he and others have seen this sense of documentation as being part of a broader collaboration across disciplines, in direct cooperation with and directly involving the speech community members. So what comes out of this, on a sort of a narrower view, is an annotated and translated corpus of archived materials. So there are now some major archives around the world, such as the Dobes TLA, the Language Archive in the Netherlands, the ELA archive at SOAS, the ILA archive, which is in Texas, and so on. And so that was the kind of outcome of the goal. And this is separate from describing the language, just separate from the Boasian notion of a grammar and a dictionary, for example. There's a sort of broader view, however, which is promoted by people like Tony Woodbury, which is not a particular kind of annotated and corpus that's in an archive, but more what he calls transparent records of a language. So materials that would be clear, accessible, understandable for anyone approaching them. And you know, the ideal goal, he says, is the philologists, the students of language in 500 years' time. And for Woodbury, description and theorization is kind of dependent on and, in a sense, parasitic upon this collection of transparent records. So they're different kind of viewpoints, but the essential outcome is that you have a large corpus or set of materials. So this second approach, this documentation 2, really came about because of the concern that languages were disappearing, language shift is going on all around the world, and developments in information technologies, media, communication, enabled the possibility to undertake major recording and archiving. There was also an increasing concern for the roles of language speakers and communities, and the notion that speakers and communities have rights and needs, and that these should play a role in research that people are carrying out. It's really important to emphasize, and I think many people get confused about this, but it's very important to emphasize that this approach, with its different methods and its practices and its theoretical underpinnings, this particular approach to language isn't limited to endangered languages. That's where it's sort of spends a lot of its energy, but you can apply this documentation approach to any variety or any linguistic type with any level of vitality. It's a methodology and a method and a practice, not just restricted to endangered languages. So what's so new? You know, what's happened between documentation 1 and documentation 2? Well, the focus on the data, structured data, the idea of processing material and creating a structured set, which we can call a corpus. The second big thing is really accountability, that we expect the materials, the recordings, the instances of language use that are inscribed in digital files, plus their analysis, to be made available to others. And in the last couple of years, there's been quite a discussion about the notion of reproducibility. That is, we should be able to go to an archival collection, go to a corpus, and reproduce the researcher's analytical steps to see if the outcome is the same or different. This is taking a model from scientific approaches like chemistry or genetics and physics, where, you know, if you have access to the data points, then you, in principle, you should be able to reproduce that. I'll come back and discuss this notion later. I think it's actually quite wrong-headed, but the larger discussion of this is perhaps a topic for another talk. The third aspect is the preservation. So the archives have become not something in the background where you just happen to leave stuff, but rather a primary focus where the corpora can be safeguarded for the long term. And a fourth point is that the heavy reliance on software tools for doing this research. The files are digital and access to them is mediated via computer software. And I'm going to come back later and argue that this component, this aspect, is actually a problematic when we think about revitalization. Now, compared to these notions of documentation, we could think about language description, and this is looking at language as a structural system. So description looks at language in use, performances, actual people speaking, and, you know, whether it's dictating a story or videotaping a conversation. Whereas description is, how is a language system structured? So it asks questions like, what do languages look like? What is their grammatical system? Notions like phonology, morphology, syntax. And this draws us into the question of how different and similar languages are to one another. So we look across languages and say, is the system of this language similar to this other one, and in what ways? So that leads to typology and so on. Then a third sort of issue that description is about is, well, what does this tell us about how the human mind works? How do we process language? How do we internally represent linguistic structures? And what does it tell us about human communication? Notions like pragmatics and the embeddedness of structures within communication systems. And also how, if we have some sense of how do children acquiring language, how do they actually develop this abstract system from the chaotic, somewhat chaotic data that's around them? So to describe languages, we have to ask the right sorts of questions. Some people have argued that we need a syntactic theory, for example, to be able to help us ask these questions. And the goal is to make generalizations and draw distinctions. So we shouldn't be just observing, pointing the camera and observing, so much as looking for deeper generalizations, broad statements about the system we're describing, and categorizing and labeling. So we need a meta language. We need some concepts, some terminology that allows us to make the descriptive labels and the categories, and to draw the generalizations. So underlyingly, it requires a framework, if you want to call it that, or a theory with the labels and the categories, and some model for argumentation and explanation. So what counts as a description in terms of the model and the explanation? It also requires us to have sociologically, socioculturally accepted objects that people working in language description recognize as such. So what is a grammar? What is a grammar as an object, as an output? And the particular structures and formats of those are, you know, we have a long history. Grammars have been written going back to Parnini in ancient Sanskrit times, and we kind of understand what grammars and dictionaries look like. So let's move on to revitalization, and I'm not going to discuss this in too much detail because I know my colleagues, particularly Julia and Sumitra, will talk about this in more detail in their presentations. So we can think of it as increasing actions or activities that we do to increase domains of language use and or increase the number of speakers, both adults and children. And it has a longer history than documentation 2 in the sort of current sense. And it's very often focused and driven by community members who deservedly will frequently show much more interest in revitalizing their languages than documenting them. There's a frequent assumption that revitalization relates to formal language learning, to notions of lessons or schooling, but of course that's not a necessary requirement. As you'll see, I'm sure, in the presentation, like the work that Sumitra has been doing, for example, doesn't involve necessarily that kind of educational model. It's usually driven by the community, whatever that notion is, and it involves creating opportunities to use the language and also to think about the ideologies and the social and political attitudes that that speakers have that might be connected to the language shift that's undergoing. And as mentioned, it frequently involves second language learning. So acquiring the revitalized language, not necessarily as the first language, but rather as a later development, and extending it into new domains and language activity. It can be bottom-up, driven by community members wanting to do something. This is how the Maori case in New Zealand developed, or it can be a top-down driven process where some authorities decide we want to get the language back, we want to develop it, expand it, and so on. And there are various models, and I'm not going to discuss these in any detail. I'm sure Julia will cover some of this in her talk as well. But there are all sorts of models that have been used for thinking about extending the domains and extending the numbers of speakers. Now, we can distinguish this from language maintenance, which is not increasing numbers of domains, but maintaining and protecting current usage. So language may well be in use in a number of different domains, but you may want to develop new genres or technological adaptations, things like Unicode for your orthography, or vocabulary management, expanding vocabulary to cover new technologies. That would be part of maintenance. Maintenance can sometimes be met with resistance. People don't want to know that their languages need support or development. And it involves a sociological dimension of understanding what's going on in order to maintain and support local languages. So increasing prestige, promoting bilingualism, some degree of literacy, if that's a goal that people want, and developing, as I say, new genres of vocabulary and so on, and often the notion of mother tongue education. So part of maintenance could well be that you're actually not teaching the language in education, but teaching through the language content from a wide range of areas. And this, is, of course, is mother tongue education. All of this work in documentation, description, and revitalization fundamentally involves management, and particularly corpus management, managing all the information that we collect, and also the information about the information, what has come to be called metadata or meta documentation. And this can be done manually or through computer software, but it really is essential for all of these different types of activities. Okay, so let's move on and look at the three types, the three different areas and the possible relationships between them. Firstly, we'll start with documentation and description. In his early work, Nikolaus Himmelmann argued that documentation is something quite different from language description. Remember, description is about the structures and the abstract organization. Documentation is about actual language use. And he says they have different epistemologies, methods, and goals. Description typically has a narrower range of methods. It often relies on elicitation, questionnaires, translation. It may include a level of participant observation, but typically doesn't, whereas documentation in the kind of second model that we're talking about really demands participant observation, collecting data in its socio-cultural context, and or some level of experimentation. Documentary linguistics is very frequently associated with things like using games or stimuli, various kind of tests, and work that comes out of psycholinguistics has been adapted. In language description, the sources of the information are often not tracked at all. And there's quite some literature on this. So there's a nice paper by Lauren Gorn and colleagues looking at grammatical descriptions. They looked at a whole range of grammars and PhD dissertations and tried to find out, where do the examples come from? And in most cases, you can't tell. Are they made up? Are they invented? Are they from writing? Are they from some recording somewhere? You can't tell. And therefore, one can argue the research is simply not reproducible because the sources are not actually tracked. Now, documentation, on the other hand, says no. Remember, one of the basic principles was accountability. So the descriptive source of the sources must be available. So what's the relationship? Here we can say either they avoid one another, and this is quite common. A descriptive linguist grammar doesn't have any connection to documentation. It's based purely on elicitation, word lists or translations, and doesn't use any of the documentation methods or doesn't collect audio, video records and so on. Or alternatively, it could be a sort of snog relationship, which is short, brief, collect a bit of data, make a few little recordings, but not actually embedded as a major activity. I'm going to skip through this. I'll leave these in the slides, but there are some reasons for saying that documentation in the second sense requires a whole range of different other philosophical and methodological differences from doing language description. And these can mean that the two are really incompatible in some sort of senses for some researchers. We can actually ask the question, as others some have done, which is whether documentation and description really are parts of linguistics, which is the way that I'm presenting them here, or whether it's whether documentation is actually not linguistics, but rather a kind of transdisciplinary a field that draws on conceptualization and practices from a huge range of different disciplines. And in fact, a really interesting paper by Frank Seidel a couple of years ago, who suggests that language documentation is not linguistics at all. It's not about doing the same kind of thing that linguists think about, but it's a kind of philology It's a sort of exegesis of a corpus rather than being linguistic. So again, they're two different, completely different things that avoid each other. They don't necessarily have much connection. Okay, so let's look at description and revitalization. Well, for some linguists, and this is quite a strong tendency, it's seen as being revitalization is seen as being a waste of time. What Paul Newman, the linguist Paul Newman, has called linguistic social work. And I've got some choice quotes for you here. Gerrit Diemendal, revitalization should not be given high priority. When people decide to give up their language, they usually have a good reason for doing so. So we shouldn't interfere. We should document what's going on, describe their languages, but don't do anything about revitalizing them. More recently, we have this kind of social Darwinist perspective from Professor Are, and he says that we have to measure our intervention dispassionately and avoid unnecessary waste. When languages are doomed, you shouldn't do anything about trying to support them or preserve them. So as a linguist, as a researcher, your fundamental job is to describe and document languages, but if they're dying, well, forget it, let them die. So avoid, keep away, describe languages, but don't have anything to do with supporting them or revitalizing them. That's a strong tendency by some researchers. What about another alternative? Well, in a paper that Lise Dobrin, David Nathan and I published a couple of years ago, we argued that documenters in particular often see their obligations to the field that they're working in, to the communities they're working with, in terms of transacted objects. Not about knowledge sharing or joint engagement or any kind of interactionality, but transferring some objects to them. So creation of things because it's kind of necessary, either because it's ethical or the community demands that you do it as part of getting permission to do your linguistic research, or actually in many cases, if you got some money from a funder, many of the research funders these days insist there must be some kind of outcome that's for the community here. So typically not decided by them, but created for them. So, you know, I will make an orthography for you, or a dictionary, or you know, the latest obsession with making apps for people. So this is snogging. Short term, I have to do it. It's all over and done with the project, but really what I'm interested in is describing and documenting the language. Now there's when we talk about documentation and revitalization, there can be all sorts of challenges, and particularly ideological and political challenges. When you start documenting, particularly languages that are under pressure and where shift is taking place, what you're actually documenting in the audio and the video isn't matching what people think that they're doing. And in fact, speakers may prefer a puristic notion of their language compared to what's actually in the video and the audio. They may not like it when they see that speakers are mixing or, you know, producing something that is not what they might think of as a pure kind of version of the language. And so there's some really nice work by Ulrike Mosel, who has looked at documentary materials that she collected using a kind of Himmelmann-Dobes sort of approach, and what happened when they tried to use these for revitalization. And what took place was editing. The teachers and the community members she was working with wanted to seriously edit those materials in various untheorized and kind of random fashion. So you know, the documentation as such it has to be mediated by some kind of intervention or editing. So it's a sort of a strange kind of relationship there. And Childs, Good and Mitchell have actually pointed out that very frequently this material that's collected, this, you know, wonderful archived corpus, it's because of its focus on essentially on grammars, dictionaries and texts, it's actually not much use in revitalization. It doesn't document patterns of variation or provide context to inform community efforts. So they really point out, and others have pointed to similar things, that frequently the documentary records, the work that comes out of language documentation, is actually quite difficult to use. And in fact, Julia Salabank and I have argued that it can be, in many cases, completely unsuitable for revitalization. Why? Well, because it often focuses on unusual or interesting linguistic features. Linguists get very excited when they discover, you know, things like evidentiality or ergativity, and that's what is in the documentary corpus. But what is lacking often is things like conversation. How do you start a conversation with somebody? How do you change the topic in a conversation? And how you do that varies from language to language and situation and context to context. How do I get people to do things in the language that I'm interested in? How is it, what's appropriate? How do I agree or disagree with somebody? If somebody says something and I really don't like it, how can I express my disagreement? Knowing about ergative or past participles won't terribly much help me with that. Also, we can find in the documentary corpora, the things in the archives, inappropriate genres or topics. So there may be discussions of material that is really isn't much use for learners in terms of the content that is being talked about. It might be taboo topics, it might be topics that are not considered appropriate for children, for example. A third kind of aspect that's often overlooked is because documentary linguists and descriptive linguists have this ideology that they're out there to get the best language. You know, I'm the best speaker of a language. They found the best consultant or informant. Those people often are very difficult for learners to understand. They may have issues of articulation. They haven't got any teeth. They're slurring. The speech is very rapid. The stories that they tell or the conversations have high contextual dependence or reliance on lots of background knowledge or history and places. So, you know, this has been my experience. You record people telling a story and then you've got to unpick, well, who was that person that you, oh, Blind Freddie, you know, so-and-so's relation to so-and. And, you know, you need to have an explication of the whole kind of set of background assumptions that are taking place. And something out of the box, something like that is not immediately useful for language learning. Sort of another dimension is that quite often the documented recordings, the material in the archives, focuses heavily on the past. It's often a nostalgic reminiscences about how things were great and wonderful when we were kids growing up, and frequently with negative evaluations of changes that have taken place between then and the contemporary time. So, you know, people complaining about how terrible language and culture and activities and social interactions are now. And, you know, this kind of negativity can be quite off-putting if you're a learner and you want to, you know, learn something positive about the future of your language. Also lacking in most documentary corpora are speech that is directed towards learners. There's a very nice website that I use occasionally called Slow Italian, and this is it's not Italian for slow people, but it's a version of Italian. It's actually the news reports, and what they do is they record these in slow speech, which is well modulated and phrased in such a way that learners can process it. So the kind of thing I just did as an example, where you're aiming to produce something that learners can more readily use. And language documenters very rarely, I don't know of any examples where language documenters actually do that. So we can ask the question, let's ask the question, what would documentation look like if it was done with the goal of revitalization? If it wasn't a snog avoid relationship, but what if it was a marry relationship, something that involved long-term commitment with a possible development for the future, and understanding on both sides. So I'm going to move on now to think about ways in which we might do things differently in documentation and description that could result in a rather different sort of relationship. What we could call documentation for revitalization. So those of you who are working on languages, who are working with communities, perhaps think about some of these as ways in which you might, if you're not already doing them, ways in which you might change your practices and approach. So the first would be that we would lean much more towards participant observation and away from experimental and elicitation methods. There's been, I think, there's quite a lot of work that's been done where people have used things like the frog story, this book by Maya, which is a series of pictures that people ask, ask the consultant, tell me what's going on in the pictures. And this is very strange activity, and I think we should move away from that. There's been too much of that kind of work done. Also observing and analyzing use and understanding ideologies and beliefs. The kind of, through participant observation, we can come to understand what do people believe about language in general and how we learn languages, but also their particular language. Do they believe it to be too difficult for outsiders, for example, or whatever? Documentation that adopted a revitalization perspective would focus on metadata categories that were relevant. Nathan and Fang, for example, have argued that the documentary record could be tagged for their content and level from a pedagogical perspective. This recording is a lovely two-person conversation about shopping, would be useful for intermediate learners. There's lots of use of imperatives that would be helpful, and it's got borrowings from Spanish in there. So, this bit of recording, well, language documenters never do this. They don't tag their material in a way that would be valuable for revitalization. The other thing that would be really helpful is if the archives which contain this documentary corpora were more accessible and intelligible to a wider range of users for a wider range of uses. And if the interface was in a language that they know and in a form that was readily accessible, then this would be much more valuable, and the relationship would be much more like a marriage, a longer term connection. This is completely unlike what we have in current documentation archives. And I have another talk, a different talk, which is a big critique of the way that archiving has been done and continues to be done. So, we end up with this is a snapshot from the ELA archive in SOAS. It's from, I'm not criticizing the linguist who has this, but his material here it's from a place in Nigeria, And, you know, we find something, we dig around and we find there's a nice discussion about who can be a chief here. And what do we get? Well, we get a something dot EAF and then a something MPG. Now, I can play the little video here and it'll play, and that's nice. The person's talking in their language. There's no translation or anything with it. If I want to see the translation, if I want to be able to understand it, if I maybe want to use it for some revitalization purpose, I actually have to know what an EAF file is. It happens as some of you will know, it's an ELAN file format. So I need to have the ELAN computer program on my computer and know how to use it. And this is an MPG, is a video format, and I have to figure out how to combine those two together in order to see the translations, etc. Well, even worse than this is the TLA interface, which is this sort of hierarchical tree structure you see on the left, and you know, click, 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 and I get down here to a particular file. It's a string of numbers, and it tells me that it's an elicitation. That's it. It's some kind of elicitation file, which is about pronunciation and tree names. Well, that might be useful for revitalizing knowledge about tree names, but what am I supposed to do with this? You know, how does it work? Well, that is not a good relationship, an ongoing relationship between a documentation corpus and attempts to revitalize. So what other kind of aspects might we include? Well, way back in 17 years ago, Colette Grineval pointed out that teaching, training, and mentoring is in a documentation is really fundamental. Engaging a wide range of stakeholders, including those people who are not actually living in the location, the sort of original location, diaspora communities, including them in planning, mobilization, execution. This can lead to the increase in language skills and practices and create stronger links between older, more fluent speakers and language learners. Instead of archiving material in that kind of very difficult to use interface that we saw earlier, maybe think about community-based archives where access is more readily available. And particularly access in languages that local people can actually use. So, you know, if Hindi is a lingua franca, well, access to the archive via Hindi or via Spanish or Russian or whatever. And the result of adopting that perspective is actually much better documentation, better translation, more culturally appropriate contexts, wider ranges of social activities, and much better materials for language learning and teaching. So it's a win-win for both sides by adopting this real engagement kind of approach. So we need a wide range of contexts, and that would include also non-traditional and contemporary sorts of events. So, you know, documenting language use in community settings, in medical centers. You know, when people want to talk to a doctor or a nurse, what goes on there, record that, document that, and use that as part of learning, language learning. And include training, not just software training, not just teaching your consultants how to use ELAN, for example, but actually more broad training that spreads knowledge and skills and increases capacity for community members, including awareness of their own knowledge and skills and agency, which may have been suppressed for sociological and political reasons. We want to record different genres from what linguists typically record. If you go and have a look at some of the archival collections, they're heavily biased towards narrative or non-conversational use. Interactions, greetings, leave takings, politeness expressions. record family language, the language used that is used within intergenerational transmission, things like lullabies, songs, riddles, culturally appropriate uses, affective terms like honey or sweetie in English. These can be very, very useful and are not frequently documented. You know, if you have a Swadesh list, it's not going to have something like hello, my love on there. And instances of learners' use of language, so documenting actual revitalization itself can be extremely useful and helpful. We should be looking also at chunks of language, a kind of formulaic expressions. I think there's a nice example from Nancy Dorian's work with speakers in Scotland. She identifies this notion of a semi-speaker, someone who has a partial competence from a descriptive perspective. You know, they don't know all the forms in a paradigm, but they can appear to be much more competent from a community perspective because they know how to interact appropriately. Well, if we studied semi-speakers and looked at what they were doing successfully at using the knowledge they have, that could help us with identifying what are the important things to know in order to be understood as being fluent. And in fact, research, theoretical research on proficient language use shows us that in our everyday lives, we use huge numbers, thousands of formulated, pre-formulated sequences. And that grammatical systems really are frameworks for recycling of this formulated language. So the Chomskyan notion of grammar as a generative device is incorrect from this perspective, because rather it's grammar isn't generating, but grammar is actually for combining and recycling. So that's a huge value, is to record those formulas and idioms and chunks of language. We also should think about documenting revitalization itself. Use the methods and techniques and approaches of language documentation, because accounts of revitalization are often unstructured stories. It can be really valuable to document processes, decision-making, events, and they themselves, by doing this, we can actually provide valuable materials for ongoing curriculum design and development, new materials and so on, and engage learners in activities and document those activities, which can help us to understand things like psychological or interactional factors that may or may not make revitalizing and transmission possible or successful. Okay, so here are my conclusions then. Looking at the relationships between language documentation, language description, and language revitalization, we see different kinds of connections that vary between different times, between different places, different socio-linguistic and cultural and political contexts, and different individuals who are involved. And there's no sort of one-size-fits-all arrangement or set of relationships that we can identify. So, you know, we can't say documentation will be really well connected to description if you follow the following rules or whatever. It's very variable and different. Sometimes the different areas avoid each other and really have nothing to do with each other. As we saw, some language describers or documenters say that there's, you know, we shouldn't be trying to save all these disappearing languages, just let them die. Sometimes the connections are brief and ultimately unfulfilling. Producing an app that doesn't work anymore because the Apple has changed the operating system, or Android has given an update that doesn't work anymore, doesn't really help anyone in the longer term. So it can be short term, but very unfulfilling. That's a snogging relationship. And occasionally the relationships are deep, meaningful, and potentially long term and rewarding. And in the best case, so deep that they lead to interactions that can extend over a longer period of time, a sort of a marriage connection, if you like. So this is my snog, marry, avoid kind of typology, as it were. As I say, just as a metaphor and not really meant in a serious way. But like long-term relationships in the real world, deeper connections between these three fields require us to develop understanding, and that means theorization and the development of communities of practice. And this has been going on, but so for example, there is theoretical work that's being done on documentation, but revitalization hasn't really been theorized to the extent that will be useful and valuable for a long-term deep relationship with description and documentation. So on the one hand, it requires understanding, deep understanding, but it also requires lots of hard work, lots of commitment, lots of practice, lots of, trying to do things and making changes as necessary, much participation and lots of flexibility. And ultimately, deep and meaningful connections between revitalization, documentation, and description requires a huge amount of patience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Austin. We are very, very thankful for this and very enlightening lecture. There are a few questions, and I saw a few raised hands as well during your presentation. So I'll also, I've made a note of the people who did raise their hands. If it was by mistake, I'm very sorry, but I would really like you to ask your questions. Ma'am, there is a question in the chat box from Dhanapati, ma'am. Or sir, I'm very sorry. I don't really know if I'm mispronouncing your name. Would you like to ask the question yourself, or should I read it out?
Yes, it's fine if you read it out.
Okay. Multilingualism is a social reality in India with the implementation of the National Education Policy 2020, focusing on mother tongue as a medium of instruction. In that case, what do we do for the endangered mother tongue? And as linguists, sorry, my chat box is, yeah. And as linguistic researchers, what one should go for, language documentation or language description? Dr. Austin, please.